Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the International Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Today in the International Grapevine, we're going to talk about the correctional system, the prison system. It's a very complex situation, a very sensitive matter, but it's important to talk about it because it affects a lot of people, some of our families, some of our friends, and what have you. And not only that, in America, there's over 2.2 million people in prison, and there's all kinds of different conditions. And we want to talk a little bit about the pros, the cons, why they end up in prison, and in certain circumstances, how they are treated in prison, and more importantly, are there any training facilities for them, just in case when they come out of prison, they have where to go, find a job and what have you? Are there psychology help for them and what have you? What better person to talk about this sensitive matter? Someone that have over 30 years experience. I'm talking about Professor Louis Marshall, who was the former superintendent of the Sing Sing. He gives us a great deal of pleasure and, of course, satisfaction to have him as a special guest tonight on the International Grapevine. Mr. Marshall, welcome to our program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about the criminal system because it's so complex sometimes, and we felt that the fact that you have worked in that system for many years, we wanted to find out, is the criminal system fair-minded?
Well, unfortunately, the system has several flaws, and it's called disparity in justice. When you mention the word system, you're talking about three disciplines.
Yes.
That entails the police department, that entails the courts, and then you have corrections. So they are independent, but their operation is interdependent, meaning that whatever happens at the first line, which will be arrest, and then taken to a court of through the DA system, the district attorney, he or she makes a decision whether there's probable cause, and based on that decision, they will take the next step where there'll be an arraignment and the whole process through the court system, and then you go to corrections. So when you say criminal justice system, you're talking about three disciplines: police department, court system, and the Department of Corrections. That's what
what happened when someone gets arrested, actually? What really takes place?
Arrest is the fact that you have lost your ability to leave from where you are because the police officer has detained you. Now, a police officer can stop you and question you. That's just general interaction. But once he deprives you of leaving the scene, consider yourself under arrest. Now, at that point, a few things can take place. First and foremost, he's supposed to tell you what is the reason for your detention. Why did he stop you? If you are going to be arrested, you're supposed to receive your Miranda rights. And Miranda rights is based on a case that existed in Arizona, Miranda versus the state of Arizona. And that law is intertwined with your Fifth Amendment, which is you have the right to remain silent, and that is applicable if you're going to be arrested for certain charges. Now, if the only thing that's going to happen is that you're going to get a ticket, then you don't need to Mirandize you, as they call it, because it's just a simple ticket for traffic ticket. So you do not have to get your Miranda rights read to you. But if you're going to be arrested and taken to a precinct, now a precinct is the place where you're going to be housed in the initial stages when you're arrested. At that point, it's advisable for you to stay quiet, shut your mouth, and don't say anything because you have no representation at the time. But it's a tendency based on human nature to immediately start to talk, usually saying, I didn't do anything, why you stopped me? and you want to do a dialogue that can take you down that road where you say something that is contrary to the outcome if you end up in a court of law. So it's advisable not to say anything in most cases after you get your Miranda rights read to you.
What happens if you don't get your rights detailed to you, telling you have a right to be silenced, but you get arrested, let's say, for X amount of a problem? What happened with that? What's your right after that?
If that is a very touchy situation, because there's no one else there to verify whether he did read it or she did read it or not. Now with the camera, you can tell because you should be hearing the interaction that is taking place. But that is a very touchy situation as far as declaring that you were not giving your Miranda rights. The same thing goes with the Fourth Amendment, where somebody, police officers come into your house to arrest you and don't have a warrant. In the old days, that Fourth Amendment will stand. After 9/11, what has happened, there is a new process dealing with breaking in an entry based on the crisis. The officer would say that he wanted to secure the evidence, so they didn't have enough time to get a warrant. So based on that, that kind of diminished the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is still there, but officers have used that in a court of law saying, well, it was a hot pursuit, meaning we had to react immediately. So sometimes that can hinder your rights to some extent.
Very complicated indeed, because you have a certain amount of rights, but I imagine because of the circumstance, the police department use it when they have to, and they claim in certain circumstances they didn't have the opportunity. While we're talking about a prison system, how crowded is the American prison system?
Well, if you generalize how crowded, you're talking 2.2 million people. But
Yes.
You have to break that down, the 2.2 million people. You have more people on parole and probation than
Yes.
actually locked up. And so now you have to break it down and find out, well, are we talking about the entire country, or are we talking about individual states? Individual states like the one that I work for, New York State, in the early parts of my career, we went as far as 75,000.
Wow.
That was sadly because of the buy and bust law that existed. A lot of young people were arrested, and Giuliani, who was the mayor at that time, he was more or less the architect of that procedure. So a lot of young men ended up getting arrested and incarcerated. So the system blew up to 75,000. As I speak right now, New York State has probably less people locked up than Georgia, where I'm sitting, which is a smaller state. New York is down to about 52.5 thousand people.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I remember very well the Giuliani period of time, how they were very aggressive with minorities, and you would stop and frisk for no reason. Sometimes they stumble on certain things, and you get arrested. You end up in Rikers Island, and you have to go through the entire court system, and then you end up upstate New York in prison. So you talk about back at that time, there was a lot of crowd at that time in the prison system. Do you think it's still crowded? No.
There was overcrowding. Well, right now, the system is overcrowded still because we have more people under these conditions than probably any other country in the world. So if you measure it against the overall world, yes, we are at a climax in terms of the amount of people that is in the system, whether it's probation, parole, and incarceration. We are still leading the charge in terms of the numbers.
When we're talking about overcrowded, I imagine in your condition as a superintendent, it must have been very difficult for you running it with overcrowded. I mean, the heat, the different type of prisoners, they get on top of one another. And I guess it get a little bit frisky with them in prison sometimes because they're overcrowded, wouldn't you say?
Well, again, you depend on what state we're referring to, because the logistics as far as the prison itself is different from state to state. As the years went by, more monies were allocated to build prisons, so they kept building and expanding capacity. Now, New York State, most inmates that are awarded to the state, because you have to separate now Once you're sentenced and it's a state crime, you go to state prison. So we farm you out to a facility that is appropriate based on the nature of your crime, the instant offense, your prior history. If you're nomadic, somebody that don't have a permanent address and continuously come into prison. So with all of that in mind, I will say that we had enough housing at the time when we were around 60,000. When we got up to 75, we had to come up with a new system, which was looking at people who were prepared for work release. Work release is a program that allows you to go out into the community, find a job, but you come back to the facility every evening. Now, these are work release facilities. They're not like the big jails, some of them that I work, maximum, medium, minimum. These were strictly minimum facilities where you have maybe a year before you release or 2 years, no more than that. So now we had to farm out people to go home to free up space with people who have committed minor crimes. That's not happening anymore because, as I said, the numbers right now in New York is down to 52,000. So we never had a serious overcrowding system because we planned something to substitute by allowing people to go home and not being incarcerated for the complete time. So you were home maybe 3 days and you come back for 2. And we do a urine test and so forth. These facilities were mainly located in the city. Fulton, Lincoln, Edgecombe, these were and Queensboro in New York City. So that helped to reduce the population in terms of overcrowding for us until the numbers actually went down. And we probably don't have enough time to get into it. We created a program that helped with especially parolees that keep coming back. Because sadly enough, 21,000 probably get released at any given time. I don't know what the numbers are now, but close to 9,000 comes back, which is sad. But that 9,000 is not people who left yesterday or last year. They may have been out for 3-4 years and now they violated their parole.
And they're back in again.
Now they're coming back in. So during my time, that was averaging about 9,000 people. You know, and myself created a program with the permission of the commissioner, whereas rather than let the individual go back upstate to serve the rest of his time, his parole time that he should have been on the street, we created a program at a place called Edgecombe Correctional Facility. So now, rather than leaving the city, he just go there, sign a contract. Now he's in if it's a substance abuse problem that brought him back, now he's in a substance abuse program there for 6 months. He don't get no visits or anything. He just stay there for 6 months. Basically, it's like a relapse program.
Where he cleans himself up, so to speak.
Yes, rather than send him all the way back up north. And in about 9 months, he's on the bus coming back down to the city again.
Wow. So let's talk about things. You know, I have read sometime that there have been certain brutality actions sometimes against certain amount of prisoners by staff members. Can you talk a little bit about that? Not specifically in New York, but all over the nation, that some of the prisoners are not treated well. They've been beaten up and abused sometime by staff members.
Well, you have to look at which school we're talking about. The old school, even before my time, that was commonplace during the old school. I'd say anywhere up to the late 1970s, these kind of occurrences happen, and the inmates didn't have really a leg to stand on. Basically, after the Civil Rights Act 1968 is when prison rights start to become a part of the big agenda, whereas he could take it out to a court of law. The old school is a superintendent. He had his own driver. He had his superintendent quarters. I have lived in the superintendent quarters for a while during my career, and they had so many amenities. All of that, a lot of it was taken away over the years. And that meant that now the inmates could bring a lawsuit against the department. Does that abuse still exist? Yes, in certain states, you will find that that abuse exists, but it all evolved around management.
Well, I mean, it's tough. I know there's a part of the prison system is a business, especially down south. I don't want to get into the business side right now, but I was just concerned about certain amount of brutality. And I believe you that years back, it was worse, it's somewhat cleaned up. Did it get cleaned up because of the uprising that happened in Attica years ago? That might have been one of the reasons why it got cleaned up.
Attica was one of the main reasons, and I can say that part of the reason I think that I got my job with the Department of Corrections I started off as what is called a bilingual counselor for the state. And that happened right after Attica that these positions were created. And what my role was as a bilingual counselor is to address the Spanish-speaking inmates, their issues, concerns, including any type of abuse. And I was there more or less to help neutralize the problems rather than letting the department have to handle it, because by the time they get involved, you get the explosion already happening like what happened at Attica. But if you have an intermediary, that was my role. I have so many inmates on my caseload. I see them once a month. So we get the chance to sit down and talk about family issues, personal issues, violation, whatever is going on in his life. And that diffuses a lot of the anger. And so therefore, yes, you're correct. Attica was the trigger that turned a lot of that around, because now they start hiring and created a position called correction counselor. In my case, mine was bilingual counselor, because I took the test for both English speaking and Spanish speaking, and I passed both of them, and I chose the bilingual one because it was a smaller amount of people that had the qualification, so they needed more bilingual counselors, and I qualified for it.
That's good that something like that has changed, because I remember reading in the papers about Attica. It was very brutal on both sides. A lot of guards got hurt. A lot of prisoners got really, truly beat up. Having said that, is there a prison policy that are used by superintendents like yourself and other superintendents that run prisons?
I think I sent you that the booklet that clearly tells you what the rules are for the inmates.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can put it up.
Yeah, Julio will put it up.
Okay. Now, that booklet has the instructions for the inmates when they arrive at the facility. Mm-hmm. Every facility don't operate the same way because they have different clientele or inmates. When you talk about a maximum prison, there's far more restrictions. A medium security have more flexibility. A minimum security have even more flexibility because they're not considered extremely dangerous. So each level have an inmate rule book to govern how the place should be run. What are the rules of engagement on a daily basis, including from their laundry to programs, everything that is necessary for him to know what he should try to address to keep him out of any additional problems from a legal standpoint.
So that policy, that prison policy goes from A to Z, covering the main important things in a prison in terms of jobs, handling of prisoners, and the do's and the don'ts. Let's break for about a few minutes, and we'll come right back in the International Grapevine talking about the prison system and the correction system and what have you. We'll be right back in the International Grapevine talking about the correctional system.
I think most Americans believe that after you commit a crime and pay your debt to society, the punishment ends. You have the chance to rebuild your life and get a fresh start. But the reality is much harsher. We punish people with criminal records long after they've paid their debt to society, and we all suffer for it. Even simply being accused of a crime is just the beginning of perpetual punishment. A cycle of legalized discrimination, poverty, and reincarceration, a cycle kept in motion by 47,000 laws and regulations nationwide that restrict critical rights and opportunities. After contact with the criminal justice system, millions of Americans are denied employment and housing, denied college educations, excluded from public benefits, separated from their children, deported despite being legal residents, and deprived of the right to vote. These restrictions trap the poor and people of color in invisible cages that extend far beyond prison walls and criminal courts. Cages that lead to a lifetime of obstacles that undermine even the most earnest efforts at rehabilitation and redemption. Cages that send the message, you will never be a part of society again. This is not some isolated problem. 95% of all incarcerated people will return home at some point. Each year, more than 600,000 people are released from jails and prisons. That's roughly the population of Boston or Seattle. Millions more are completing non-jail sentences like probation, community service, or fines. As reentry specialist at Brooklyn Defender Services, a public defense firm representing 45,000 clients per year, I work on the front lines to help people with criminal histories overcome their past and navigate the obstacles of their present so they can build a sustainable future. I try to help folks take responsibility for their own lives, but it's hard to do when the outlook is so bleak. Even for low-level offenses and misdemeanors, the aftermath of one individual's experience with the criminal justice system ripples out to entire families and neighborhoods and gets passed down from generation to generation. The result, more poverty, more crime, more incarceration. I see Javon, an 18-year-old young man who cannot live with or even visit his family, and cannot find an affordable apartment because he was convicted of gun possession and banned from all public housing. I see the dangerous shelters and street corners where he'll sleep. I worry about what he's going to have to do to survive, how long it'll be before he's back behind bars. I see how society loses when Judy, a 58-year-old grandmother charged with a misdemeanor, is fired after her arrest and barred from her lifelong profession as a home health aide. Unable to work, she's faced with eviction and can't support her family. When Malik, a 26-year-old father, is denied the opportunity to further his education because of the mistakes of his past, I think about how he and so many others are set up to fail. How a conviction on a rap sheet is only a snapshot of a moment in time, when all of us are dynamic, changing over time. The criminal justice system disenfranchises these men and women, preventing them from growing, from truly being free. I am among the very few fortunate enough to be living a second chance. 3 decades ago, I was involved in a crime that took the life of another human being. I spent over 24 years in prison for my role in that reprehensible crime. While incarcerated, I had the chance to participate in a pilot program offered to only 15 inmates that allowed me to pursue a formal education. Upon release, I found an employer willing to look beyond my criminal record, one that saw the hard lessons I learned in prison as an asset, not a liability. Affording people a real opportunity to re-enter society isn't just good for individuals and families. It's good for all of us. Meaningful re-entry increases productivity, reduces poverty, and saves money. Most importantly, it makes us safer by eliminating the circumstances that perpetuate cycles of crime and punishment. People already get punished harshly by the system, but they shouldn't receive a second sentence that makes discriminating against them legal for the rest of their lives. By restoring full rights of citizenship to people after they've been through the system, we can start to end this cycle of perpetual punishment. We can start to abolish the justice trap.
And we're back here in International Grapevine talking about the correctional systems, the pros, the cons, and some of the difficulties running a prison. And Mr. Lewis Marshall has been kind enough to be on the Grapevine talking about that sensitive issue, which is the prison system and the responsibility involved with it, and the treatment of prisoners and the pros and cons. You talk a little bit about the policy, which was very good. Is there one thing about the policy that you like more than what you didn't like in the policy, for example?
Well, I never found any discrepancy in the policies that we applied, but there's always room for improvement.
Sure.
So we always try to look for other methods to diffuse unexpected problems. So New York State is very flexible in adding and taking out things out of the original policy to make sure we have clarity. And one of the things that I was able to do is have the policy for inmates at Sing Sing, the book translated in Spanish. And I think they do that at most of the facilities now, because in most cases, at least 23% of your population, or maybe only 13, depending on the facility, the size of it, will have Hispanics in the facility. And by having a rule book that is in Spanish, it gives them an easier chance to understand what is expected of them.
I agree.
Rather than for them to do the no comprende when they get in trouble. So when you put up the book, you see very clearly has that Sing Sing rule book was addressed to myself as the superintendent. But I think every facility has some degree of rule book that governs what is expected from them. Inclusion.
And that's good. That's a good thing because they know the pros and the cons. Do you think the criminal system is broken? Sometimes you hear the media talk about how tough it is and they feel that the criminal system is broken. What is your feeling about something like that?
Well, again, when we go back to the criminal justice system, now we're talking about the entire three disciplines, which is arrest,
Yes.
courts, and correction. Unfortunately, the system is broken because the rule of law is not applicable to everyone equally. It's not. And I don't think it ever has been. Usually, like everything else in life, those who have the purse, those who have the money, have better representation. And a poor indigent young man who get arrested, he may have committed one or two crimes, but the third time around when he got arrested, he was not the person culpable, but now he don't have no proper representation. In New York State, we call it 18B lawyers, and they have caseloads at knee high. So it's just almost like on you running an assembly line. You got to try to get rid of this caseload. So they usually recommend plea bargain, so you get less time, even if he was not culpable in the crime, because the argument going to be, but you already have 2 strikes. If they find you guilty in a trial, you're going to spend 10 years. Now, the difference between 2 years and 10 years is a vast difference. So you have young people that will fess up and say, okay, I'm guilty. So that's one of the discrepancies. And again, we are human beings, and in any discipline, police, even in the church, people are biased and prejudiced. Don't fool yourself. I will say that emphatically because I have been part of all those different disciplines, and I've seen the bias and the prejudice. So, being Black in America, obviously, for sad reasons, there is a perception, and the perception is real in the person's mind that is perceiving you. It may not be truthful, but you can't take away the perception. So you can get arrested and go to court and decide to go for trial. And sadly enough, if the jury find you guilty and he have a window from 5 to 10 years, unfortunately, I have seen, based on looking at thousands of records, for the same crime, same instance that occurred, that person going to get maybe 6, 7 years versus somebody who is a white morphology, and he may end up getting 2. So therefore, yes, there is a discrepancy in justice.
Well, part of the problem in the system is this, as you mentioned a little bit, I'll go a little bit further. There are certain minorities, whether it be Black or Latinos, don't have the legal representation or the affordability to afford a proper attorney. So sometimes they cut a deal that is not favorable to them, and they end up doing time, where if they had the proper attorney to back them, they would probably get off. Then there are other circumstances that the police department in a good place like New York and New Jersey are somewhat biased and aggressive against Latinos and minorities, and the first hook that they got is to put them in prison. And we can attest to that with this Black Lives Matters that have brought out to light a lot of terrible and awful behavior by some police, not all, because there are good cops out there, but some of them are not that kind and not professional and not trained, and that forces people to end up in prison. And it's a sad thing, and it's a difficult thing to understand at times.
Okay, that incident that occurred right here in Georgia, where the young man was obviously drunk, from what they detected, now you have choices to make as a police officer. Among those choices is lock up the car, take the keys, and he already told him that his sister lived close by, drive him to his sister's house, hand her the keys, they can pick up the car tomorrow. Nobody dies. Next option, lock up the car, let him find his way to his sister. You don't want to do that because he's already half drunk. You don't want to get in trouble in the street. But if you choose to do that because you don't want to put him in the car, so now he's going home. The car is there safe. You have the keys as an officer. You leave it at the precinct. He can pick up the keys the following day. Nobody dies. Rather than that, they decide at the 11th hour, they're going to handcuff him. They turn it into an arrest. When really arresting somebody should have substance, whereas you use all the resources and recourses that you have to your disposition before going to the ultimate. An arrest is the ultimate. It's deprivation, incapacitation. You're supposed to be wise enough where you look at somebody, if you're not racist, and say, okay, people do drink. It's legal. It's just that you can't tell how much before you get drunk. Everybody cannot determine that. So now you as the officer, you're in control. Lock up the car. That takes care of the severity of getting hurt in a car. Then drop him off wherever, or call a Uber. Let him get in a Uber and go home. We are supposed to be about protecting human lives rather than trying to be the adversary. And you didn't ask that question yet, but I'm going to tell you, some police officers come in the system, and correction officers, with a rogue mentality, R-O-G-U-E, a rogue mentality. They're ready to do battle. I'm going to fix those people. They immediately see themselves different than the people who are in the community. From the time you decide to have this division in your thinking, you already determined that your confrontation is not going to be based on understanding. It's going to be based on control.
That's what I said a few minutes ago. A good portion of it is lack of training. Another portion of it, most of these officers live in the suburbs. They don't live in the urban area. So when they come across minorities, they have a mind decided already. That instant that you talk about what happened, this young man lost his life unnecessary. None of that was necessary. As you mentioned, they could have called a Uber, they could have called his sister, but it was a type of thing that's always harsh against minority, and some people don't want to understand it, but it is a problem in our system right there and then. Why is it that our incarceration is so large here in America? Is there a reason for that?
There are various reasons. Like I said to you about the court system, you get some young men that are black that get into an altercation, 99.9% chance they're going to end up at the precinct. You go to suburb and a white community, the officer will engage those young people and talk to them and tell them to cut out, to stop doing what you're doing, go home. And he will use good communication skills to resolve the conflict. In the black community, it's about arrest. I'm going to lock you up. And as long as you have that mentality, that's the kind of action you can carry out. And sadly enough, and I want to say this, the symptoms of the problem is what we see every day. Those are symptoms. I'm going to tell you where the root of the problem is. You ready?
Okay.
The root of the problem is the chief of police and the district attorney. I'm going to tell you why. And I shared this information with the chief that just resigned in Atlanta. I sat down with her before all of this mess, and I told her that in the training that you have right now, one of the things that a component that is missing in all these police departments is an enculturation. You need a session that deals with enculturation, how to deal with other cultures. America is not a monolithic society like if you go to Sweden or some of these countries that where the 99.9% are white. America is a polyglot, especially New York and the big cities. So you have to tell that new officer, look, you're going to encounter people of different walks of life. They talk different, they act different. You have to give
look
them
different
some
sometimes
of what need to be addressed when he encounters these people. Second thing I told her, before he graduates, you have to take the officers, the trainees, to the community. Let him meet some of the merchants in the community, go to a community meeting. Now he's familiarizing himself, like you said, because he came from the suburbs or rural area. This is the first time he's having a contact with blacks or Hispanic in a close-up setting. So he realized they're not all about the 6 o'clock news. The next thing is, I said to her, you need the district attorney to have the last session before they graduate. The district attorney should stand before the class and tell them, congratulations, now you are part of the criminal justice system, and your responsibility is to try to diffuse the conflicts that happen in the community. But if that fails, then my responsibility when you bring people before me is to use the rule of law. Let them know I am not here representing you just because you're wearing a uniform and a badge. This is where the problem is. The officers are comfortable that they can get away with beating up somebody, like they had those 5 people laying on the floor in the hot street and the concrete. Kids.
I saw it. I couldn't believe it.
Why you put handcuff on a kid? They don't have no driver's license, so they couldn't have violated anything. They were in a car. So what is going to be their charges? There's no charges against the kids, but it's a mindset. Now, if you have a chief of police that represents the leadership, he will never tolerate that from his officers. And I'm speaking to you from personal experience. We don't have enough time. I run one of the most violent prisons in New York State, known as Coxsackie Gladiator School. And they asked me to come there because everything hell break loose. My first step when I arrived at the front gate was to sit down at my desk and tell my secretary, call the district attorney, and tell him I need to see him as soon as possible. He came in, I closed the door with him, and I said, you know why you are here? You are here to know what my rules of engagements are. I sat him right across my desk. I said, let me say this to you. The 8th Amendment to the Constitution, cruel and inhuman punishment, is not applicable to no human being legally. So therefore, you have to take the position that you're going to enforce the law for the inmates and my officers if they violate the rules of engagement. I'm not compromising with anybody. I'm not going to testify on the officer's behalf if he's wrong. Now, when you hear somebody speak like that, and you're a correction officer or a police officer, you're going to think twice or 3 times before you do something stupid, because you know whether you like that chief or not, he's not going to back for you simply because you're a police officer. He warned you, you see? And this is what I did wherever I worked. People knew what I stood for. They may have called me some names when they got home. I have some paperwork here, some racist wrote many years ago when I was a superintendent at Wallkill prison, another prison called Wallkill, one of the most racist area. But after a while, I changed the culture. Why? Because I was able to be consistent. Trust me, they can change. They're not going to change when they leave the building. But when they come in the building, the work setting, you set the tone as the leadership.
I happen to agree with you 100%. Part of the biggest problem, like I said, is training. And some of the police department are excessively racist. And some people don't want to understand that. We have a few minutes, but one of the things I want to talk about is rehabilitation while you're in prison. Is there a school system to help them, to educate them so that when they get back out, if they get back out in society, they can look for a job? Is there a system out in society that will also help them find a job if they're well behaved, if they took the education system that the prison is giving them, or is there no education rehabilitation system in the prison?
Okay, I can't speak for New York. New York have a pre-release. Pre-release is when you're getting close to being released, and you go to that little center in the facility, and you do different exercise. They teach you how to write your resume. They conduct little sessions, like if you were sitting in front of somebody, you're applying for a job, to do that role playing. We do all of that. In fact, sometimes, even though I've been the superintendent at different prisons, I will participate. And I will say to the inmate, I say, the one thing you want to do when you meet the employer is tell the truth. Tell him you made a mistake, you were in prison, but now you're just asking for a chance. So now we do that in New York State. That's pre-release. Then we have work release. Work release is another step before you actually go to the front door, where we allow you to go and look for a job. Going back now in reverse, education, yes, we have. Sing Sing have 3 different levels of academics, believe it or not. We have even a master's in theological seminar.
Wow.
I said that, master's. And you can put the picture up with myself and Ari Belanfante and some of the inmates. They're all graduates of the master's in theological seminar. And we have a 4-year degree program at Sing Sing, which was one of the most violent prisons in America in the early 20s. And now it's probably one of the most, receptive to helping people better themselves. We have theater in there.
Wow.
We have people that come from off 42nd Street that deal with the theater and help train some of these guys. We had a West Side Story in the prison, inmates acting the role and so forth. So we have a lot of activities. I had about, I can't remember the numbers now, about 12, 13 shops, carpentry, plumbing, masonry, floor tiling. So every facility don't have all those programs, but they have something, and it's mandatory for those that don't have a GED. we encourage them to get your GED. The ones that don't have to participate is, I think, if you're like 40 years of age, I'm not sure. But everybody else that don't have a GED, we put them in the GED program. And that program is run at most of the facilities in New York State that you can get your GED. We have English as a second language, ESL. Okay, so we have these teachers that teach English as a second language. So New York State do a lot of preparation to help you to go back out. And like I said, the work release is where you go to look for the job. We assign a parole officer with you. He goes to the site, see where you're going to be working, see if it's acceptable. And when you get paid, you have to put certain amount of money in your inmate accounts. That's towards when you're going to leave finally. So you bringing back some of the money that you're working for and put it in account. We mandate that you put some of it in there. And the parole officer goes to your house if you are out for 2 days and come back 3 to see the environment you are living in and so forth. Very expensive process. But what is surprising to me, California spends more money than New York State per inmate. California is $81,000 per year per inmate, one person. New York State, I don't know the exact numbers now.
Is that the cost? Is that the cost for incarceration?
I just gave you the numbers for California, 81,000. That's per person.
Per person?
Yeah. Now, New York State is about, I think it's around 40 something or maybe more, because all of those programs I mentioned to you, you paying somebody a salary to teach them. Like I had about 18 or 19 correction counselors at Sing Sing because of the size of the facility in terms of housing. We tried in New York State to give them a counselor that is sufficient for certain amount of people, rather than just throw 150 people at one individual. So we hired the counseling according to the population, and Sing Sing, we had a deputy for program services, and an assistant deputy for program services.
Well, we have approximately 3 minutes, but I want to get this thing in. How good and how strong and how effective is the parole system once a prisoner come out of jail and is on parole? What is the expectation of the parole officer on the system?
Well, again, this goes back to the individual, because when you're in the streets, the person who is your parole officer, you are expecting that him or her to carry out the proper procedures. Now, my niece is a parole officer in New York State, and same name, she's a marshal also, and she's very strict. She tried to help the men as much as she can, but not every parole officer going to carry out their duties with the diligence that they should, because I can tell you right now, and there's some parole officers going to see this video because I know them, some of them are on my page, they don't get a lot of supervision on the street. Remember, this guy is out there, he pulls up, he's checking on people living in different communities, and then he get back in his car and leave. I'm going to tell you, I have parole officers that I know that said to me, I'm not going upstairs in that multi-dwelling building. I stay downstairs in the phone booth. During those days, there was no cell phone. He'll call the guy and tell him, come downstairs, look at him, you all right? Get back in the car and leave. Now, this came right out of parole officer mouth, telling me that. So therefore, again, those type of responsibility that don't have close supervision require honesty. That's where it get lost and they get a bad reputation. New York State changed the parole system right now. It's directly under the Department of Corrections.
Right. Well, let me just say this. We have run out of time, Mr. Marshall. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the family of the International Grapevine and our listeners to thank you so much for these important things about the prison system. And more importantly, your expertise and experience has been a real pro for us who have been watching this program. And we don't have words to thank you. And hope that you come back, because we want to do a part 2 on this thing, because there's a lot of other things that we want to touch about the prison system.
And thank you very much again. And I am willing to assist in any way that I can, because the public need to know the truth, which help us to make better decisions as we go along in life.
I agree with you. And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the International Grapevine, and thank you for being our audience. And we hope to see you next week at the same time and the same place. Good night.